have this gene that predisposes them. It's similar to the BRCA gene for breast cancer. What that tells us, if someone has that gene, is that they are at increased risk, but not that they will develop breast cancer. And so for people who have this particular genetic profile, they are at increased risk. And many of you probably heard the story, maybe you've heard the TED story, the TED Talk. James Fallon is a neuroscientist at UC Irvine, maybe emeritus now. And he was doing a study there. They did functional MRIs, functional neuroimaging, on people who were diagnosed as psychopaths. And the way we do that, there's a structured instrument called the Psychopathy Checklist Revised. People, has 20 items on it. You get a score of 0, 1, or 2. People, if it's you definitely have one of the 20 traits, you get 2 points for that. So the max you can get is 40. People 30 to 40 are considered psychopaths. So they do these interviews mostly on prisoners and then on a control population, age and gender matched controls. They rate the psychopaths and they sort the fMRIs, right? And along with genetic coding into the piles. And he's going through the piles. And he and his family got screened as part of the control group. And he's going through the piles with his research assistant, and he says, oh, this one, in the control group, this one is clearly misfiled because this is clearly abnormal. This belongs in the psychopath pile. And his research assistant says to him, well, I have bad news for you. It's not misfiled, and it's yours.
Okay, so that is a great story.
And it turns out he is descended from the Cornell family that had some problems with serial killing, same family related to Cornell University, and related to Lizzie Borden. So there's a fine family tradition of doing some pretty bad stuff.
Which is to your point exactly, Judge Borstein, isn't it, that it might not matter.
First of all, let me also say, the day may come when we can identify these genes more. The studies also relate to environment, though. In other words, they take the science and relate it to the nurture, the environment. They're not totally separate.
Right, and that's what they were saying, I think, is that
right. So we don't know which is more predominant or not. What we do know is some people with the gene don't act out, are not violent. So it's a higher risk. The other thing is not everything that sounds good is worth doing. Right? We also have to consider what the risks are. What do we do with this information? For what purpose? What's our ultimate goal? What's the invasion of privacy? What do we do if we can figure this out? Do we isolate people? Do we not? Do we, when do we identify them, and what do we do when we identify them? So I think that's always worth considering, the intent in doing this.
Which is why we're one of the reasons. I mean, I think that one of the things that is interesting, that sort of is a jumping off point from that, is that you would agree that the brain behavior and development of a juvenile is different from an adult, that they have a different awareness, a different capability, different thought processes, impulse behavior, and reaction to pressure. I mean, Jonathan, when you have, well, first of all, Andy, talk about that a little bit. What is the reality of how a child's brain is different?
So in some ways, it's very obvious. Some people have known for thousands of years. So many people have known for thousands of years.
We know what childlike is. We know what
right.
that is.
But particularly with the advent of scanning, so now people can actually see brain scans, which was just visual images is so powerful. And with some other research, I think it's become more and more clear that there's some real science behind the idea that the teenage brain is immature, right? It's different functionally and to some extent structurally from the adult brain.
How is that? I mean, just like clinically how?
Sure. So a couple of different ways. One is this idea of top-down connectivity. That the teenage brain, teenagers can be very smart, and they can have a lot of passion, but in many ways, the riders really seated firmly on the saddle, right? So they can be as bright as all get out, but their ability to actually modulate their emotions and their behavior as a result, of course, is much more limited. And another way, I think, is that teenagers respond to rewards in a really powerful way. If you look at brain scans of teenagers, you hold a piece of pizza in front of them in the scanner, and all the brain just lights up, and they don't respond to punishment nearly as well as adults do, right? So if you're a teenager, and I think about that a lot when I try to deal with my teenage daughter, right? Like rewards, right? It's all about rewards. But for a teenager who is, 16 and full of vim and vigor, right? The potential negative consequences just dim into the rearview mirror, right? They're all about what can I get now? It's really gonna feel good. So as a result, of course, the Supreme Court now, Mr. Monahan and the SJC, there have been several major rulings in recent years, really sort of taking seriously the position that teenagers are different and we should not hold them responsible in the same way.
I mean, I know, Jonathan, you think about this with your clients all the time. When you have a young defendant, someone who's charged with a serious crime, this is part of the
Well,
way.
there's been a whole new development based on the research that Andy refers to, which the courts have now pretty much accepted as the law. That is, adolescents, these dividing line is 18 now. Under that, they're deemed to be less culpable when it comes to at least punishment, because they tend to be more impulsive, they tend to be less able to see the consequences and to evaluate the consequences of their action. And starting a number of years ago, the Supreme Court held that you can't execute a person under the age of 18. And that was followed a number of years later by a case which held that you can impose a life without parole sentence on somebody under 18 who has not committed a homicide. And then finally, just recently, the court held that you can't impose a life without parole sentence on juveniles, even those who have committed homicides. You can't make it mandatory. And just a couple months ago, the Massachusetts Supreme Court held that you can impose a life without parole sentence in any case on a juvenile who has committed a
And what's the
homicide.
logic of that?
Well, the logic is that because of their difference in brain development, they tend to be less culpable. Critical to all the decisions is the notion that for a juvenile, you cannot really say this person is beyond redemption. And the court makes that one of its critical determinations, that where there is hope in a juvenile that that person's character is going to change, you can't take away the rest of his life, because he is capable of change and rehabilitation, unlike people whose brains have fully developed and are less amenable to that kind of change. So it goes to culpability, but the developments will be extended, I'm sure, to other aspects of the law relating to juveniles.
Sort of in the cliche of the hardened criminal, that a juvenile can't be a hardened criminal because their brain, and we talk about this a little bit, Ron, that is that sort of a, I mean, I know that's a wild analogy, but I mean, is that sort of right?
Well,
Are they more, is the juvenile more likely to be able to be rehabilitated, or they're maybe or maybe not?
to the extent that that analysis, and certainly Justice Breyer's analysis in that case, but and others, that to the extent that it relies upon the potential for rehabilitation, I think there's some merit in that. The idea being that the frontal lobes are not fully myelinated, they're not fully formed. Frontal lobes were a general part of the brain where a lot of what we call executive functions reside, sort of dampening down of impulses, being able to think and sort out and plan. And so the idea that, well, gee, if this person, as this person gets older, their nervous system will mature and they will do better, and they'll be able to control themselves, so they have more potential for rehabilitation. To the extent that it relies, at least in part, on culpability and finding fault, one of the things that we, some of the characteristics that we find in people who are psychopaths are pretty much what Andy described. That the rider is not fully in the saddle, that things aren't fully integrated, that they don't have control over their impulses, they are very much driven by reward, they don't learn from punishment,
They don't learn from
They
punishment.
don't learn from
I mean, what can
punishment.
parents take from this? Right? I mean, that's, we're sort of,
Just pray for myelinization.
is there a way to make that happen? I mean, honestly, is there? Go ahead, Ed.
Part of it is just about trying to buy time, right? As a parent.
Seriously,
how
buy
many-
time?
To buy time, the development is a really powerful force, and one of the jobs of a parent is to keep your child alive and from getting into too much trouble while development happens. And if you look at the
I
sort
mean,
of.
that's daunting, that's scary, especially, isn't it? Because if you have a child, I've said to my friends that, in fun, only 18 more years, you'll be fine, But it turns out that that's sort of true.
But to some extent, it's true for every parent. It's true for every parent, right? You want your child to reach some age of maturity without having gotten in a car with a drunk driver, without having gotten pregnant, without having done this, without having done that. All these dumb things that kids do, right? Even really bright kids do. So part of it is just trying to take care of them as well as you can and protect them as well as you can. And at some point they'll be old enough to protect themselves. And to some extent it's luck of the draw, right? Which kids have really tragic outcomes.
I mean, Jonathan, you just had a case where you know that two juveniles got together and decided to rob another one. It's sort of like, you want to go do this? Yeah, let's go do this. Which is a very juvenile decision-making process. And how do you deal with that? How do you tell a court about that? And I'd love to hear then what the judge says about when he hears about those kinds of decisions.
Well, this was a case involving 15 and 16-year-olds, and two kids decided that they were going to rob a third kid because he was fat and a nerd and he wouldn't fight back. So they set up a deal to buy a small quantity of marijuana from my client, and they pulled a gun, and he did fight back. He had a knife, and he was terrified, and in the struggle that ensued, one of the assailants was killed. And so, looking at it, one way, these are just kids, and how can you understand why two kids would decide to rob another of a small quantity of marijuana to get high, and one of them winds up dead. But you can see the impulsiveness with the kids who were the assailants. You can see how they were subject to peer pressure. The other kid, one kid said, "Let's do it," and the others went along. So a lot of these characteristics of children play out in a situation like this, and sometimes the results are terrible. Now, in this case, my client was acquitted because the jury found he had acted in self-defense. One of the issues that came up in the case, and is going to come up more and more frequently, is how you inform jurors of what the standard is.
Let me ask the judge about that then, because I think this is something that's going to fall to you. How many cases have you heard like this? How many juries have you had to give instructions to about this kind of case? And what do you think is your job when it comes to informing juries about the mind of a juvenile?
30 seconds
Yes,
or
please.
less.
I mean, I take two.
I won't extend more than 60 seconds. Well, let me answer that by making clear a number of things. First of all, we've had juvenile courts in the United States. My recollection is since the late 19th century. Either Chicago or New York was first. So we have, for a long time, treated juveniles differently.
I mean, initially they didn't have lawyers, they didn't have juries.
No, the due process right revolution with Earl Warren and the court in the late 50s and 1960s is a different piece. But we used to treat juveniles, at least for purposes of punishment, some would argue, at least try to treat them differently. What's happened since then is both a due process revolution, giving juveniles lots of rights, that they should have gotten all along, and also punishing them, quote unquote, in a better way. What you see now with the Supreme Court of the United States, with the State Supreme Court of Massachusetts in two very dramatic rulings recently, is more attention is being paid nationally to sentencing, period, adults and juveniles, on, for example, the distinctions between crack cocaine and cocaine, which made absolutely no sense in the federal sentencing structure. So there's, and you have judges, retired and sitting judges, Justice Kennedy, a sitting judge, Justice O'Connor, retired judge, speaking nationally saying we put too many people in too many prisons for too long in the United States, and that is absolutely true. This is a society with a huge prison business. I think we incarcerate more people in the United States than perhaps any country in the world. I think South Africa and Russia are close to us. So there's a whole move now to examine sentencing, period. Now, in the context of that, you get young people at the age of 18 or under 18, and society has begun, and as reflected by the studies, professionals like we have here with us, and also the Supreme Court getting it, saying, is it really fair to sentence people who commit a first-degree murder at 17 and lock them up for possibly 70 or 80 years? Because you may live that long in a prison. Is it fair to do that to them? Is it fair to do that in society? Are we getting anything out of it? That's why you see Miller versus Alabama saying you can't in a mandatory way. And that's why you see the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts saying you cannot do that, period. They're different. They really are. However, let's also make this, I want to make this clear. Nowhere in Miller versus Alabama, the Supreme Court of the United States decision, or the two recent ones from our state Supreme Court, do they say it is unconstitutional to convict someone under the age of 18 for committing first-degree murder. They do not say that. Nor do they say you must release them on parole at some point. They're entitled to a parole hearing if they're convicted of first-degree murder. So they're not saying either thing.
So
In
you
fact,
can't be not guilty because you're young.
correct. So what they say is, in one sentence, the unconstitutionality of this punishment arises not from imposing a sentence of life in prison, but from the absolute denial of any possibility of parole. That's the focus. That's what's unfair, to lock these young people up forever without any chance of parole. That's not fair, that's not right, and they don't deserve it. But you can still convict them of first-degree murder, and you could even deny them parole.
I mean, is that a function of that a child's life is longer? You know, so a life sentence for somebody who's 50 is shorter, or is it a function of it's not going to make a difference to keep them in longer?
They are not as dangerous, and they do not deserve the punishment that a more mature, more developed brain deserves.
And when you heard about the changes in sentencing, I mean, just there's the District Attorney Association came out recently saying that if you're you should keep juveniles in prison at least for 35 years, and then let them out when is it 35 years or when they're 35? 35 years. So what about that? Is that where did they get that number? Does that make any sense?
I have no idea. I mean, supposedly they're cooked in 35 years and they're ready to come out. I can only assume it was a guess that they came up with it.
No, I think that comes from the fact that the minimum now for second-degree murder is 15 years. And if somebody's sentenced to life for second-degree murder, has to serve 15 years before being eligible for parole. And when the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court just decided this case, they said that even for first-degree murderers or juveniles, the 15-year minimum mandatory is applicable. Now, the DAs, of course, were very unhappy with that because they think that 15 years is much too short a time as a guaranteed punishment before being eligible for parole. And so they've come up with any number of other proposals. Some states have said, okay, we can't sentence him to life, so now we're gonna sentence him to 70 years. Well, that's the equivalent of life, and a number of those sentences have been thrown out. So the DAs here can't go that far, but they won't go for 15, so they pick something in the middle. And
Well, let's talk a little bit about,
that's where you get.
let's talk a little bit about knowing right from wrong. And to talk about that, I mean, that seems like a very, to us, it seems like a very simple concept. You know, if someone's 15, how does their brain work about right and wrong, and how do they gauge that? And for parents who are wondering, you know, I can't believe my son or daughter is making this decision. Why is it that they would?
So I think there are a couple of populations here. One is bronze people, the psychopaths.
My peaks.
Right, who sort of may have only some sort of vague intellectual idea of right and wrong, don't have any real sort of moral sense of which one is going to be that. Then there's your average teenager, I guess, who is who may have some intellectual idea, is able to recite right versus wrong, but in the moment, we all have such experiences, I think, in the moment, just gets carried away, engages in some degree of rationalization, just doesn't really think about it. There's a way in which one aspect of adolescence is this extreme selfishness, right? Adolescents can be so self-absorbed, can be cruel sometimes, can be really sort of really lack. I mean, they seem very sociopathic in certain ways. And I think sometimes for adolescents.
What do you mean? What's an example?
So I think just bullying is an example, right? It's that the way that kids bully one another, tease one another on the playground, even in a very sort of day-to-day kind of way, and how pervasive that is in your local third grade adolescents. I think they have not yet learned empathy. Many of them, right, have not really learned empathy, and so they just don't even think about what the other person is feeling.
Is there anything for parents to do if they see that happening with their children, and does that necessarily escalate, or does that diminish?
So I'd say it doesn't necessarily escalate, but there certainly are things that parents can do. And one thing that parents can do is just take a really strong stand, I think, when they see their child acting in a certain way, is make it really clear, we don't do that, that's not acceptable. And I think for kids, that can have a real impact. Again, if it's a child who's truly conduct disordered, or so on their way to be a sociopath, there's to some extent kind of a lost cause, perhaps. But for most kids that engage in these behaviors, it's a learning opportunity for them.
And how do you know who's a lost cause? And parents would be worried, are nervous, are wondering whether if their child comes home and is a mean girl. How do they know which ones that isn't going to go away?
Well, we don't diagnose psychopathy in children, although there are more efforts to develop scales to evaluate these things. What we look for in little kids, particularly, are what we call callous and unemotional traits. So back in the heyday of psychoanalysis, the defining characteristics, what they taught us to look for in people who were going on to be problematic are fire setting, bedwetting, and cruelty to animals. And in all the forensic cases I've done, I've only encountered this twice.
Really? Because that's like classically, standardly what people think of as the...
But I have to say, these two people were full-blown psychopaths. Yeah, one was ended up being a double murderer because he murdered somebody that got him into prison, then murdered somebody else in prison. And the other had, in a drug deal, guy hadn't paid him money, he and a friend held somebody hostage and tortured them in a motel room. And I asked the questions, it's more out of interest than anything else, because I've interviewed lots of psychopaths who don't have those things, but these two had it, and they were two of the scarier people I've ever met.
How old were they then?
Well, they were adults.
So could you have known that, is there a way to know that someone, at 15 will turn out to be a double murderer, or somebody who...
It's interesting because I actually spoke to both their mothers. Oh, my son would never do that. Oh, no, he had a little trouble, he had a little ADHD, a little attention deficit, but he was a good kid. And, the rap sheets on both these guys were huge. So there is such a thing as parental blindness.
I mean, Andy, I know you think
So-
about this, you know, what should parents be aware of? And at what point are you overreacting as a parent? And at what point are you being smart?
Right, so a couple things. One is, I think, it's a wonderful, part of me says it's a wonderful thing that even these guys can have mothers.
We'll talk about it after
And I think one trap parents get into sometimes is that they see their child behave in a certain way, and it feels so portentous. It's like they're 6 and they do something, pull the cat's tail, and like, oh my God, he's going to turn out to be a murderer, right? It's easy to do as a parent. But for parents whose kids have real conduct disorder behaviors, but I think one of the first things that needs to happen is the parents need to engage, shift their stance, and engage in kind of a harm reduction strategy, and become much more vigilant about what their kid is up to, right? And one of the things that like a parent really needs to do is go on their kid's computer, find out what they're posting on Facebook, take a look at their phone, and search their room. I often say to parents, you know, go to your kid's room and do a search. And had Jacob Barber's room been searched at some point, they might have found a knife, right? Because the last thing a parent wants is to have their child who's irritable, reactive, and kind of angry, walking around with a knife, right? Because all it takes is one incident.
Well, but, you know, did they search John Ogren's bedroom? And they eventually did, I mean, afterwards, and found diaries and pictures and drawings. Forgive me, what you should tell.
Well, they didn't find, I mean, they found things, but not things that you wouldn't find in any kid's room. I mean, as I said, he did have an obsession, so when they went to his computer, they found a number of websites where he looked at knives. And, you know, hundreds of knives. And,
I mean, I wonder if this is exactly why I brought this up, because at what point, Andy, is looking at knives a bad thing rather than just, you know, an interest in medieval weaponry?
So for me, I think there's a really clear line between someone having an interest or talking about it or fantasizing about it and taking steps, taking action, right? It's that step into the real world that's the scary time. So when you then go ahead and buy a knife illegally, right, an 8-inch blade or something like that, that's a problem, right? If you're looking at knives on the internet, it's a different story.
How is a parent supposed to know, I mean, when behavior is unacceptable or scary?
Well, I'm a big believer of the very scientific test of, you know, when the hair stands up on the back of your neck.
So you think there is an instinct?
And so there's, what I think Andy is speaking to is sort of this notion of situational awareness, of being able to contemplate sort of what we would call as a differential diagnosis. Is this just normal behavior? Maybe, but I better pay attention to it, and I better keep an eye on it. And so if there are, you know, too many complaints, if suddenly the play dates drop off, if there are too many complaints from other parents, if there are too many calls from the school about not just disruptive behavior, but cruel behavior, bullying, that sort of thing, it's time to pay attention to those things, because I think there can be interventions, and again, especially for young kids. I think, you know, you can do play therapy, you can do individual therapy, there are lots of things. But I have to tell you, when people get to adulthood, there have been no established helpful therapies for people with psychopathy. In fact, traditionally, the evidence has been that standard insight-oriented, you know, talk therapy actually makes psychopaths worse.
Because they're thinking about it?
Well, because they learn how to con and manipulate people. Oh, that's how, and they behave as if, they learn how to behave as if they have certain emotions like empathy. They do a good job of play acting that, as if they're sympathetic, as if they're depressed. And especially if you put them in group therapy in prisons, then they learn a lot. They learn a ton.
But talking about what you learn at home, Judge Pelosi, I'm sure you know about this case. There was a case in Florida recently where a judge, I think he was a 14-year-old boy who was charged with killing someone, convicted of killing someone. And the judge gave him a longer sentence than he might have, saying because the child came from a good home, he should have known the difference between right and wrong, that he was So that he didn't have this judge said he didn't have the excuse of not knowing the difference between right and wrong. He clearly did. And as a result, the punishment should be more stringent. What do you think when you hear that?
I'm troubled about punishing someone for someone else's behavior, or because their environment should have led them to somehow not break the law. You punish someone for who they are in front of you and what they've done, I would hope, and do they have a chance of rehabilitation, not for the environment in which they grew up in.
But the idea
Because
that-
you also made me think about the other young man who was put on probation after an OUI vehicular
The
homicide.
affluent.
Oh, right, the
Affluenza case, which that's the other extreme of you were spoiled, therefore you don't deserve to be punished. So, look, sentencing is one of the most difficult things a judge ever has to do. It may not look that way in the media, but it's certainly one of the most difficult things because one wants to be fair and needs to be fair. And I think what you have now is an active set of appellate courts that are looking at this more profoundly than we ever have.
I mean, I know this isn't a very judgy question, but what's in your heart when you're sentencing a juvenile? What goes through your mind besides the law? Or can there be anything?
One of the main things that went through my mind in sentencing young people is there a chance that this person can be turned around, can be rehabilitated, can be helped, can become a contributing member of society? That's overwhelmingly what went through my mind. Again, though, and I know this is not what you're asking, but I've got to tell you, compared to the rest of the world, the United States is a prison population, is a prison-heavy sentencing society. Even in most of the other world's democracies, first-degree murder by an adult does not get life without parole. That is extremely unusual around the world. In most places, I forget the sentence that the man got, and he was not a juvenile. He was young, but in Norway,
20 years. I think it was
for
The one who shot the
67 homicides in that spree, 20 years in Norway. So I think in most countries in Latin America, our equivalent of first-degree murder carries, I think, 30 years, 35 years in prison. In Europe, very rare. So I think part of this is a reaction back and a pause. What does it mean to sentence people forever? Put them away, no chance of ever getting out.
Well, there are often, I mean, Andy, I know you do expert testimony forensically in courts about young people. And Jonathan, you call juvenile brain experts in your cases also. And you talk a little bit about that. Why are you called to testify as a witness in trials of juveniles? What is the reason for that? And what is the goal of that?
You know, I think there's several goals, but I think part of the goal is an attempt to humanize the individual, right? Because it's so easy for a jury or a judge to impose a harsh sentence on someone that is the other in some way, non-human, less than human, and that just the ability to tell someone's story can really make them come alive. And even though they've done something that's really heinous or sort of awful, once they're a human being, then I think sort of juries certainly see them in a different light.
Do you talk
And most
about
of-
brain development of juveniles?
I do to some extent, and I also talk a lot about background. I think that you know, I worked for many years at the Suffolk County House of Correction, doing psychiatry there, and it's a lower level or a correctional facility. But what struck me was both how consistently I found the people there to be human and approachable, and how consistently they had horrific histories of trauma. Right, there really was a very sort of uniform story, which was bad genetics, probably of one sort or another, exposure to prenatal drugs and alcohol, awful parenting, right, neglect, abuse, real trauma, and then substance abuse themselves, and often with some element of head trauma as well. So they ended up being really damaged people. Not bad people necessarily, although they certainly had done bad things. Not callous necessarily. Some of them were really very human, but really damaged people.
Can I also add to what gets lost in all this, and you sort of dance around a little bit? how little of this comes out about most people who are in the House of Correction or in prison, how little the judges hear this, how little juries hear it, how little the courts hear it, how much people become a number, an other, as you called it, how most people are not lucky enough to have these doctors come in and do a workup. And so they become sort of part of this mass of humanity that just gets shuffled off, often forever, without anybody ever hearing it. I retired from the bench. I do some criminal defense work since I left the bench. One of the first things I ask a lot of the defendants that I represent is, I'd like you and your family, as best as you can, to write up a biography, an autobiography. I want to know about you. Where'd you go to school? Where were you born? Most of the time, the reaction is, nobody's ever asked me to do that. Nobody's ever asked me to tell where I grew up. Did I have injuries growing up? Was I hospitalized? What was it like growing up in this kind of home? And it's a part of the process. I tell folks, I sometimes include it in letters to district attorneys. Let me tell you about this human being that you would normally only hear about in the courtroom really quickly with 30 other cases that you have that day.
I mean, I know, Jonathan, exactly on that point, your handling of juvenile cases has changed over the years to bring in those aspects of their lives, correct? You bring in expert witnesses to talk about their background, their brain development, and their upbringing. I mean, remember the case of Tashambi, who was charged with second-degree murder, and on the day that he was being sentenced, his for the whole entire trial, his mother never came to the trial. You hear the 14-year-old charged with murder, and the mother never came to the trial.
This was at a time when there was a procedure in Massachusetts where people charged with, or juveniles charged with murder, would go to the juvenile court, and there'd be what's called a transfer hearing, where the juvenile court would make a determination as to whether or not this person could be handled within the juvenile system or transferred to adult court, which was a long-standing practice in Massachusetts. In terms of talking about where sentencing is going, Massachusetts now, and until this recent decision, was one of the worst places in the nation for sentencing juveniles. It was one of the few states which imposed life without parole for juveniles convicted of first-degree murder. And that's
As young as a 14-year-old.
Yeah, 14 to 17. It took, Massachusetts took them out of the juvenile court. And if somebody between 14 and 17 is charged with murder, they're automatically tried and punished as an adult.
What do you think about that concept, any of you? That the rules can just anoint someone as an adult? What about that?
I think it's terrible, and it includes the 14 or 15-year-old, I believe, is it Andover or
Yeah.
the North Shore that is alleged to have killed a teacher? He was 14 or 15, and I think indicted for first-degree murder in Superior Court.
I mean, there's no choice. If the prosecutor indicts you for murder, first degree or second degree, you're treated as an adult. And until this recent decision, the only sentence, if you were convicted of first degree murder, was life without parole.
So let's briefly talk, because I want to take questions from you all, so be thinking of what you'd like to ask. But talk about parents a little bit. What's the responsibility of parents? What do you hear from parents? What would you say to parents? Should parents be, are they at fault? Should they be blamed if they allow, if their child is allowed out to do something they don't know and they don't stop them? Anybody, who has it?
Well, I mean, by the time I get to the case, parents can't do it. It's too late for
I mean,
that.
is there something that you see in parents? Is there a pattern that you see in the parents of the young people that you represent, an attitude?
Well, I think it's clear a lot of my clients come from broken homes and disadvantaged communities and have suffered abuse, and you know, the result is clear. You're going to have the kind of problems that they face, and they don't have the kind of parenting that they needed in many, you know, for many reasons. But among them, parents themselves are disadvantaged and don't have the wherewithal to do what's necessary.
And back to this, go ahead.
I think the mental health system fails these families so frequently because it's in general so hard for parents to find effective care for troubled children in Massachusetts and everywhere else in this country. And I think mental health clinicians and child clinicians in particular have a hard time with kids who are aggressive and kids who are angry and kids who engage in these sorts of criminal behaviors. Because a lot of mental health folks, I think, just have a hard time acknowledging it, seeing it themselves, being sort of really kind of clear-eyed about it. And it's so common for pediatricians and therapists to say, oh, you know what, it's just a phase. They'll just pass out of it. And the treatments aren't very good. But the treatments that have been shown to work for conduct disorder, like parent management trainings, are hugely cost-intensive, time-intensive, very hard to access.
And goal-intensive, someone has to really be devoted to doing this and think and believe that it can make a difference. So what do you think?
Well, so one of our colleagues, Jean Beresin, who ran the Child and Adolescent Fellowship that Andy went through, gave me these numbers a while back. And I think he said the estimate is that there are 20 million children and adolescents in this country that suffer from some sort of mental health problem. Andy is one of 6,000 board-certified child psychiatrists in this country. We graduate 360 a year, and there are maybe 8,000 or 10,000 child psychologists. Those are the folks taking care of, or supposed to provide services for 20 million kids with mental health problems. We can't even keep up with the kids whose parents recognize and seek out help. So it's a huge struggle. And you know, just to go back to the comment that both Jonathan and Andy made about trauma, the burden on our society caused by child abuse and neglect is unbelievable. But when we talk about finding fault, those parents, again, as Jonathan talked about, the parents being disadvantaged themselves, those parents are often that's how they were brought up. And so talk about, forget genetics, because we do pass things along in families. Now, some people, some of my geneticist friends would argue, well, that propensity to impulsivity and violence and substance abuse, which we know is genetically linked, right, in a huge portion of cases, that all gets passed down. And unless there's some sort of intervention, we don't break the cycle, and we just keep making more.
Well, my last question is, how realistic do you think then defending Jacob was? Pick any character. Did you read it, Judge? Okay, so what did you? Bill Landay said he wasn't going to come. Bill Landay said he wasn't going to come tonight, so we could really talk about it and not be worried that he would have his feelings hurt. The idea that Andy Barber, the prosecutor, was a prosecutor in the past, tried to protect his son from this, tried to get his son out of it, tried to manipulate the system so his son, even though he suspected him, wouldn't be charged. What do you think about that?
I think it makes a lot of sense, awfully naive, because I think it postpones for another day a really deeper problem. But what dad wouldn't do that. So I can't blame him for those instincts, but extremely naive about what it all meant in the end, I think.
And what
I
about,
liked him though. I mean, I found him likable. I understood where he was. He was a great voice in the book. I thought.
yeah, I mean, you're meant. He's the hero. He's the hero, and you're meant to empathize with him. What about the mom? What about the underneath lying story of the mom? Talk about parents with clear heads.
I'll say two things. One is my sense, and when I finished the book, was that the mom really was the protagonist. She was the one who sort of off stage went through real changes, right? Andy Barber remained kind of benighted and blind to it all throughout the book. It reminded me a little bit of William Hurt in Body Heat. You guys, right, who narrates, very sad, narrates from a prison cell what happened. He finally realized a little too late, right, what was going on. It's sort of Andy Barber's position. But the mom actually really came to understand. So I thought that was just fascinating. The other thing that I'll say is that what really struck home as being quite true was the family's experience of having a child who is in trouble in that way, and the kind of sense of social isolation and mutual blame between them and guilt. And this sort of, it's like this free-floating blame. Someone's going to take the hit for this. Is it Jacob? Is it Andy? Is it Lori? Someone's going to be blamed for it. It reminds me so much, actually, of parents that I see of kids who are really behaviorally disturbed. And the huge stress and the shame and the blame and the guilt that goes along, such an impact on the family structure.
I want to hear more about that. But now you may recognize that the lawyer in defending Jacob, the silver-haired, benign defense attorney named Jonathan, is based on Jonathan Shapiro. So when you read the book, this is who that character actually was based on. Little known fact that you learn here at Brookline Reads. So what did you think from the standpoint of the defense attorney?
I thought it was a really good story. As I've said, I thought that the using the murder gene as the basis for prosecuting this kid was far out, but it made it a good story. I thought the ending was great. I did think it implausible that a mother would kill her son, but it was a shock.
Because what that brings up is exactly what you're talking about, Lana. There's some people for whom there is no intervention possible, and do you think that's what the mother realized? I mean, how true is that?
Well, is it the mother realizing that and, committing this social act, sacrificing
Or
herself?
is she the one with the murder gene?
Right. Well, no, but, or is it her being altruistic in doing this, or is it the shame and the guilt
What do you think?
of being involved in it?
Let's call Bill. What do you think?
Yeah, well, a little bit of projection. In terms of characters, I thought he did a wonderful job with Jacob, because you just don't know. I mean, he's Dad, oh, he's able to joke around, he's able to be relaxed, he's able to be a normal kid. And that sort of chameleon-like quality, and to be able to function that way after having murdered somebody.
What does that tell you?
He's the real deal. He has that quality. So, and I kind of like the grandfather as well. It's a lovely family.
Who has a question? Does anyone have a question? Yes. Stand up, okay?
Sorry?
Stand up if you will, so we can hear.
Okay. Earlier you were talking about the difference between the adolescent brain and the adult brain, and especially around impulsivity. I've heard research recently about the difference between the male and the female brain. I'm just wondering if you have any insight into that as far as how that would relate to culpability of male versus female. Maybe I've heard as old as 25 that the male brain maybe doesn't fully develop.
She's asking, just for the tape, but she's asking about the potential difference between male and female brain. And she said that she's heard that the male brain is different up to age 25 from the female.
There are a lot of 35-year-old women who would say it's way too bad, actually.
That's the next panel. Do you know anything about the differences?
Yeah, I think, we know in general that girls mature sooner than boys in the myelization process and the maturity. And so that probably continues. I don't know exactly those numbers about that age.
Are there more male psychopaths than female?
There are, but one of the things that people have written about is that there tends to be a gender bias in terms of how we diagnose psychopathy. And a lot of personality traits that we attribute to borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, if you had those same traits, those same behaviors in a male, we would say it's part of antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy. So it's a real gender bias.
What do we say if it's a female?
Sorry?
What if it's a female, what do you say?
Oh, if it's a female, we say borderline personality disorder or histrionic personality disorder. So conning and manipulative behavior in a man can be seductive behavior in a woman.
Interesting.
The other thing I'll say, if you look at all the risk factors for violence, let's say in teenagers, there's a long list of them, maternal cigarette smoking, neglect. The single greatest risk factor that trumps everything else by far is being a male. Now, whatever you make of that, and what that has to do for culpability is an important question.
Yes.
I have a question, and I don't know if this is an unfair question, but it will be relevant as the nature of people in Massachusetts keeps changing. But is all of what we've learned and all of what you all know, either from a judicial or medical perspective, heavily influenced by Western society? Because you're going to have very different attitudes about age of consent or responsibility, let's say in the Somali community, at what age that kicks in, which is actually younger. And so the question then becomes, is our constructs too heavily influenced by our Western experiences, that this would be very different if we were looking at immigrant communities or communities that didn't grow up in the United States?
Is there a Western brain?
I would just say that psychopathy is a psychological construct that has been found to be quite universal. The Inuit have a concept for this, right? Describing someone who, tries to steal other people's wives and steals from them and hurts them and murders people. It's throughout multiple societies. Now, on these other issues of brain development, sure. I mean, I think there are certainly nutritional differences, there are environmental differences, but it's a pretty universal brain.
But I'd also say it brings up the importance of neighborhood, sort of family, neighborhood, and culture. I remember looking at a case recently of a young man who became a gang member. His father was a gang member, all his uncles were gang members, his grandfather was a gang member, and that's all he ever knew. He was sort of raised to be a gang member. That was his world. And so, no surprise he became a gang member.
Yes.
This may be in the realm of science fiction, but you started out talking about the murder gene, and is it possible that at some point, since genetic mutations are so much more described today, that culpability will tie in with genetic analysis?
Will culpability be tied in with genetic analysis? Does that make
I
sense?
think that's one of the dangers that Judge Bornstein raises, and I think it presents, and I think you see a little the difference between the medical and the policy people in the panel. I don't think there is a connection between genetics and criminal behavior. There may be some traits which are related in some way, but once we conclude that there is this connection, and that you can tell by a gene or other aspects of a person's genetic history that he or she is going to be violent or antisocial or a murderer, then we've got a real problem. We see how that's developed. Certainly the Nazis made use of just that kind of approach. And were we to do that, and of course we see it already. We see people do have stereotypes and associate different races with criminal behavior, and that's a very dangerous thing.
I agree, it would be very dangerous to do that on the basis of genetics alone. But people are doing it, we're doing it based on behavior. So you raise a wonderful question about the issue of culpability. So let's say we have the neuroimaging, we have everything else, we have the history, forget the genes, forget doing scanning the DNA and analyzing that. But we have a picture, we have the psychopathy, so we say this person's a psychopath, right? So what do we do about those people? Well, do we say, okay, they're not responsible? The societies that have addressed this, our country with regard to sexual predators, the sexually dangerous person statute, where a person serves out their criminal sentence and then they're determined to be a sexually dangerous person, we commit them to the treatment center for the sexually dangerous at Bridgewater for 1 day to life. And they stay there until they can prove they're no longer sexually dangerous.
And when they get out, they're marked. They have to be in the post office
Exactly.
and in the city hall for.
England does this with what they call dangerous and severe personality disorders. They have criminals, and they medicalize it. They put it on mental health professions. And the people are just warehoused because there's no treatment for this. England does this, the Netherlands does it, some other countries do it as well. So where people have said, ooh, we think this is a pattern of behavior that's likely to continue into the future, it's sort of medicalized. And, all right, we're not going to punish them, we're going to, quote unquote, treat them, and we put them into institutions.
Where, of course, there is no treatment.
Right, and they're just confined.
And what I'll say is, look, as a physician, for me, the idea that genes influence our behavior, well, of course, I'd say of course, because all I have is genes and environment and the interplay. In terms of, think about the causative factors. What I don't have as a psychiatrist is any real understanding of free will and how people make choice. And why one person who has this particular genetic makeup, this particular environment, makes a choice to not do something, and the other person with the same background makes a choice to do something. I can't answer that. I can't even answer
And you spend your life
question.
with that. Yes, in the back.
Can you say more, please, about the concept of sentencing? The whole theory behind sentencing and what we're trying to accomplish.
So
With that.
she's asking about the concept of sentencing. This is a question for you, clearly, I think, and Jonathan. Are we trying to punish someone? Are we trying to rehabilitate them? What is the goal of it, and how do we know whether that works?
Well, I'll start by saying one of the reasons the Supreme Court of the United States and Massachusetts has adopted new positions on mandatory sentencing is that one part of sentencing is discretion. Do we look at the individual? Do we hear from all parties, victims, others, and try to understand who the person is, and then fashion what might be appropriate? We can talk in a minute about how do you reach an appropriate sentence. But the other aspect of these decisions is the mandatory part, which is troubling, which is there is no discretion. You get convicted of this crime, you get this amount of time, period. It's a terrible punchline, but it's almost like a joke when judges schedule a sentencing hearing on a mandatory sentence. What's the point? The law says you must sentence that person. So on the discretion side, historically people look at things like general deterrence or specific deterrence and keep this individual from committing this again, they're dangerous, or just deserts. What's the right punishment? You did something, there has to be a consequence. We're going to fashion that sentence. And then rehabilitation is the other aspect. So the four famous theories of sentencing with discretion. What's going on now is an attack on the mandatory, non-discretionary kind of sentencing. So we really look at the individual.
Does it work to punish someone, a juvenile child? Does it work to put them in prison and incarcerate them and keep them separate?
I think the best thing I can say is it can work if it's done with other things. If it's just to punish alone and isolate and deprive of all human contact, of respect, of dignity, it's probably going to backfire. But if you package a sentencing in a more humane way with other aspects of support and probation and a program and the like, it might work better. There's a better chance it's going to work.
What about neurologically? Does it work?
Well, I think about all these kids, for example, that have aged out of foster care and end up in jail, right? People have never really had attachment figures, people have been sort of emotionally bereft. You put them in jail. Jail is a brutal place, right? Jail is emotionally, it's a place where you really have to sort of shut down and man up, and they're not going to learn any of the things that they really need to learn in a jail setting. It keeps them off the street, so to that extent. But I certainly don't think that they're going to come out 20 years later having some greater capacity for genuine human attachment or empathy.
If it worked, we wouldn't have recidivists. And Jonathan, how much does the idea that when you see someone go away, what do you think will happen to them?
Well, I mean, the statistics are terrible. There is a very high percentage of recidivism. That is, if somebody is convicted of most crimes, the likelihood that he or she will be back convicted of another crime is very high. And that's a huge struggle for judges to try to craft a sentence that is going to make a difference. One is not rehabilitated in prison. If you're sending somebody to prison, it's not to rehabilitate that person. It's essentially to punish the person. I think, generally speaking, that kind of punishment doesn't work. Drug crimes continue unabated despite the fact that 50 or 60% of the people in prison are convicted of drug crimes. You don't, people who are addicts are not going to be changed by spending years or 10 years in prison. So it's a very difficult, impossible task to figure out what to do. And I don't think we've achieved that as a society at all.
Yes.
Thank you, first of all, to a great panel. The question I have is about whether or not I think we might be running afoul of the fundamental attribution mechanism. The juvenile delinquent might be very happy to have you sit down in front of him or her and say, I understand where you're coming from, I understand your background, what might have led you to commit X, Y, or Z. But if you sit down in front of an athlete and say, well, the reason you're so successful is because you have a great coach, great parents, great this, they tend to say, well, no, hang on a second, this is me, I did this, I worked hard, this is the result of my behavior. So it struck me when you made your point about talking about free will. I'm not sure about our ability to even explain behavior consistently, let alone face the kind of challenges for defense.
And so you're asking about, he's asking about free will, and how would we even figure out if someone is well-adjusted and happy and successful, and you say this is because of other things, they say no, it's because of me. If someone is troubled and violent and unhappy and disturbed, they don't say it's because of me. They say it's because of something else. What about that?
I'll
I'll let Andy get out of the headlines.
Andy's looking at me like, go away.
They go away. One of the worst prognostic signs in any relationship, in our daily lives, our personal lives, our professional lives, and certainly with regard to people like this, so you asked about sort of signs when you know that there's a real problem, is the inability to accept responsibility. And the idea of attributing, blame attribution to others is something that I look at whether I'm evaluating lawyers who've gotten into trouble, doctors who've gotten into trouble, people in the criminal justice system. The idea that, well, no, one of the psychopaths with the triad that I talked about earlier, basically his explanation was, well, the guy made me kill him. Really? It wasn't self-defense, it was just he needed killing, and it was his fault because of who he was, so I needed to kill him. That sort of thing. So, John, when you talk about the idea, that's really key, and it's something we have to listen for about, how people rationalize their behavior. It's a good prognostic sign if someone who is in the criminal justice system says, I really screwed up.
Or help me.
Now, of course, people can be pretty good at mouthing those words, but, the people who at least seem to have some degree of sincerity in terms of saying, yeah, I did this. You can hold out some more.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming this evening. It's been completely fabulous. And of course, we could talk about this forever. I want to remind you that Bill Landay himself will be here
At the Brookline High School.
at the Brookline High School auditorium on March the 12th. And I'm sure he would be delighted to hear all of you. That's going to be a marvelous evening. You have a flyer that also talks about movies that are coming up, other events that are coming up, ways to get Defending Jacob, ways to read Defending Jacob, ways to tell your parents. We're very grateful that you came this evening. Thank you so much.